Have you ever walked into a room and felt the energy shift, not because you did something wrong, but because a quiet alliance had already formed against you? Maybe it wasn't obvious at first. Maybe it started with small things, conversations that stopped when you arrived, glances exchanged across the table, decisions being made without you, even though you were once included in everything. At first, you probably questioned yourself. Was it something you said? Something you did? Humans naturally search for reasons when they feel excluded. But what happens when the pattern becomes undeniable? What happens when you slowly realize that several people have aligned themselves, subtly pushing you toward the edge, hoping you will remove yourself so they never have to confront what they're doing? Group dynamics can be powerful. When individuals come together, especially in environments where status, comfort, or control are involved, something interesting often happens. People begin protecting the group narrative. If someone challenges that narrative simply by being different, independent, or unwilling to conform, the group may quietly turn that person into the problem. Not through open conflict, not through honest conversation, but through pressure. Sometimes it looks like isolation. Invitations slowly disappear. Important messages somehow don't reach you. Your ideas are dismissed without real consideration. Other times, it becomes more psychological. Jokes that seem harmless on the surface, but carry an underlying message. Comments that question your character. Subtle attempts to make you feel like the outsider in a place where you once belonged. And eventually, the goal becomes clear. They want you to leave on your own. Because if you remove yourself, they never have to admit what happened. The group stays intact. The story stays comfortable. And everyone avoids the difficult truth about how they treated someone who simply refused to play along. But here's something that many groups forget. Truth has a strange way of surfacing over time. In almost every situation like this, there is at least one person within that circle who begins to notice the cracks in the story. Maybe they laughed along at first. Maybe they stayed silent because it felt easier. But slowly, something starts bothering them. Why were you treated this way? Why did the conversations about you feel exaggerated or strangely coordinated? Why did certain people seem so invested in pushing you out? At first, that person might ignore the feeling. It's uncomfortable to question the people around you. Social pressure is powerful, and nobody wants to be the one who disrupts the group. But doubt is persistent. Once it appears, it doesn't disappear easily. They start replaying moments in their mind. They remember things you said that were reasonable, but somehow twisted by others later. They remember times when you tried to resolve misunderstandings calmly, yet the narrative continued to paint you as the problem. They notice how quickly certain individuals shut down any conversation that might show your side of the story. And slowly, something shifts inside them. What if the person they pushed away wasn't the problem at all? What if the group needed someone to blame, someone to isolate, someone to quietly remove so that deeper issues within the circle would never be examined? These questions can be unsettling because they challenge the comfort of belonging. But once someone starts seeing the situation clearly, the illusion that held the group together begins to weaken. And when that illusion begins to weaken, something very interesting happens inside the mind of the person who is starting to see clearly. At first, they try to rationalize it. They tell themselves the group must have had good reasons. After all, when several people repeat the same story, it begins to feel like truth. That's how group narratives gain strength. Repetition creates confidence, even when the foundation is fragile. But the human mind is also wired for fairness. Deep down, most people have an internal sense of balance that quietly asks difficult questions. If someone was truly the problem, why did the situation require so much coordination behind the scenes? Why were conversations about that person always happening when they weren't present? Why did certain details keep changing depending on who was telling the story? These questions begin to grow louder. The person observing all of this might not confront anyone immediately. In fact, they often become quieter. They start paying closer attention to the dynamics that once seemed normal. Small moments suddenly carry new meaning. The jokes that once seemed harmless now sound different. The dismissive comments about you now feel rehearsed rather than spontaneous, and that's when a deeper realization begins to form. Sometimes groups don't unite because someone is truly harmful. Sometimes groups unite because it's easier to agree with each other than to challenge the strongest personalities in the room. In many social circles, one or two influential voices quietly shape the narrative. Others follow along, not necessarily because they believe it completely, but because disagreement carries its own risks. No one wants to become the next target, so the story about you continues. Not always because everyone believes it, but because it's the safest story to support. It protects the group's comfort. It keeps the hierarchy stable. And most importantly, it avoids the uncomfortable process of self-reflection. But the person who is now seeing the truth can't ignore what they're noticing. They begin recalling moments that didn't fit the narrative. Maybe they remember a time when you helped someone without expecting recognition. Maybe they remember a conversation where your perspective was thoughtful and calm. Yet, later it was described as something completely different. Memory starts connecting dots that were once scattered. And the more those dots connect, the harder it becomes to pretend nothing is wrong. This realization can feel unsettling for them. Recognizing that a group may have treated someone unfairly means acknowledging that they themselves might have been part of it, even if only through silence. That kind of awareness isn't easy. People often carry quiet guilt when they begin to see situations from a new angle. So they watch more closely. They observe how certain people react whenever your name comes up. Do they rush to control the conversation? Do they quickly change the subject if someone questions the old narrative? Do they seem unusually invested in making sure the story never changes? These reactions reveal more than words ever could. Because when a narrative is built on shaky ground, it requires constant protection. The moment someone starts asking genuine questions, the entire structure feels threatened. And that's when subtle tension begins to appear inside the group itself. What once looked like unity starts revealing hidden cracks. The person who is now noticing all this may not speak up right away, but internally, something has shifted. The image they were given about you no longer matches the evidence they're seeing. And once that mismatch becomes clear, it's only a matter of time before the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Once that shift happens, the person who is beginning to see clearly starts noticing something else that was always there but rarely discussed. Groups that unite to isolate someone often rely on a very fragile balance. Everyone must continue playing the same role, repeating the same assumptions, and protecting the same narrative. The moment one person steps outside that pattern, the entire structure begins to feel unstable. And that is exactly where the tension begins. The observer who once stayed silent now starts questioning things internally. They notice how quickly certain individuals react whenever the past is mentioned. They notice the defensiveness that appears when someone asks a simple question like, "Are we sure we understood that situation correctly?" Instead of calm explanations, the responses suddenly carry irritation, avoidance, or even subtle hostility. Why would a simple question create so much discomfort? Because when a story is built on exaggerations, selective memories, or misunderstandings, it cannot survive honest examination for long. It requires agreement, not curiosity. It requires silence, not reflection. The person watching all of this begins to realize that the effort to push you away was never just about you. In many cases, it was about preserving control inside the group. When someone is independent, calm under pressure, or unwilling to participate in certain behaviors, they can unintentionally expose the unhealthy patterns that others would rather keep hidden. Removing that person becomes the easiest solution. If you're gone, the group never has to confront those deeper issues. Conversations remain comfortable. Everyone can continue believing the simplified story that was created. But the observer can't ignore the contradictions anymore. They start remembering how quickly the narrative about you formed, how certain individuals repeated the same phrases again and again, almost like rehearsed lines. They begin to wonder whether people were truly reacting to your actions or reacting to the version of events that was presented to them. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges the sense of unity the group once relied on. If the story about you wasn't accurate, what else might be misunderstood? What other assumptions have gone unquestioned simply because everyone agreed to move forward without examining them? And slowly, the observer begins to see something else. You didn't remove yourself because you were weak. You removed yourself because the environment was becoming impossible to navigate honestly. When every action is interpreted through suspicion, when every word is reshaped by group conversations happening behind closed doors, staying becomes exhausting. Walking away can sometimes be the clearest response to a situation that refuses to be fair. Now the person who once watched from the background begins to see that your departure changed the atmosphere in unexpected ways. Without you there, some of the tension that was blamed on you didn't disappear. In fact, new conflicts may have started emerging between the very people who once seemed perfectly aligned. Why would that happen? Because when a group focuses all its frustration on one individual, that person becomes a temporary outlet for deeper disagreements. Once the outlet is gone, those unresolved tensions begin surfacing elsewhere. Small disagreements grow larger. Old alliances begin shifting. And the observer realizes something important. The peace that the group expected after pushing you out never truly arrived. Instead, the same patterns simply found new directions. That realization plants a quiet but powerful question in their mind. If removing you didn't solve the problems everyone talked about, then perhaps you were never the real problem in the first place. And once that question settles into someone's mind, it rarely disappears. In fact, it tends to grow stronger with time. The observer who once accepted the group's narrative now begins looking at everything with a different perspective. Conversations that once seemed normal now feel strangely rehearsed. Certain reactions begin to look less like honesty and more like protection of a story that can't afford to be questioned. They start noticing how quickly some people become uncomfortable when your name is mentioned. Not angry in a confident way, but uneasy, almost as if the topic itself threatens something they would rather keep buried. Why would someone react that way if the situation had truly been as simple as everyone once claimed? The observer begins to realize that certainty inside the group was never as strong as it appeared. Much of it was built on agreement rather than evidence. When several people repeat the same interpretation, it can create the illusion of truth. But illusions don't always survive distance and reflection, and distance has a powerful effect. With time passing and emotions settling, the events that once felt urgent start to look different. The observer remembers moments that didn't match the accusations. They remember times when you tried to speak calmly while others dismissed the conversation. They remember how quickly some individuals shut down any attempt to hear your perspective. And slowly, a deeper understanding begins to take shape. Groups sometimes create a shared explanation, not because it's accurate, but because it protects everyone from uncomfortable self-examination. If one person becomes the center of blame, the rest of the group can move forward without questioning their own behavior. It's a simple psychological shortcut that appears in workplaces, friendships, families, and communities everywhere. But shortcuts eventually lead to dead ends. Because when the real issues are never addressed, they don't disappear. They wait beneath the surface, quietly shaping future conflicts. And that is exactly what the observer begins to see now. The same patterns that once surrounded you have started appearing again in other situations. The same people who were quick to criticize are now involved in new misunderstandings, new disagreements, new tensions. The pattern didn't leave when you did, and that realization changes everything. It forces the observer to reconsider the past with more honesty. Maybe you weren't difficult. Maybe you were simply unwilling to participate in dynamics that others had learned to tolerate. Maybe your presence highlighted contradictions that people preferred not to confront. Sometimes the person who steps away is not escaping responsibility. Sometimes they are refusing to remain inside a cycle that can only continue if everyone agrees not to question it. The observer understands now that removing someone from a group does not automatically erase the truth about how that person was treated. In many cases, time reveals more than arguments ever could. People begin connecting details they once ignored. They begin recognizing motivations that were hidden beneath confident words and collective agreement. And when that happens, the narrative quietly starts to change, not through dramatic confrontations or public apologies, but through something much quieter. Awareness spreads one person at a time. Someone begins speaking about the past with more caution. Another person admits that the situation might have been misunderstood. A third person chooses silence instead of repeating the old accusations. The story that once pushed you out slowly loses its certainty. Because truth has a patient nature. It does not always appear immediately, and it does not require loud announcements. It simply waits for people to look closely enough and honestly enough to see what was always there. Over time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The people who once felt completely certain about the story start experiencing moments of quiet reflection. Not everyone will admit it openly, and not everyone will be ready to confront it directly. But the shift becomes noticeable. Conversations that once carried confidence now carry hesitation. Statements that once sounded absolute now include phrases like, maybe, or perhaps we misunderstood. Why does that change occur? Because certainty built on group pressure often fades when individuals are left alone with their own thoughts. When people step away from the collective voice of the group, they begin examining events through their own memories rather than through repeated narratives. And memory has a strange way of resurfacing details that were once overlooked. Someone might suddenly remember how calm you were during a disagreement that later became exaggerated. Another person might recall how quickly others dismissed your explanations without giving them real consideration. Small details that once seemed unimportant start forming a larger picture. And that picture doesn't always match the version everyone accepted before. For the observer who already started seeing the truth, these moments feel like quiet confirmations. They notice the subtle changes in how others talk about the past. Some people become unusually quiet when the topic appears. Others shift the conversation quickly, as if they'd rather not revisit it. And occasionally, someone might cautiously say something that would have been impossible before. Maybe things weren't as clear as we thought. That single sentence can carry a lot of meaning. Because once doubt enters a story that relied on certainty, the entire foundation begins to soften. People start realizing that pushing someone out didn't resolve the deeper dynamics that were present all along. The group may have believed that removing one person would restore harmony, but time reveals a different reality. Harmony built on avoidance rarely lasts. New misunderstandings appear. Old tensions resurface. The same personalities begin clashing in ways that were once blamed on you. Gradually, it becomes harder to maintain the idea that everything revolved around one individual. And this is where the deeper lesson emerges. Sometimes the person who walks away is simply the first person who refuses to continue participating in an unhealthy pattern. Their absence does not erase the pattern itself. It simply removes the distraction that once allowed everyone to avoid looking at it. For the observer who now understands this, the realization can feel both uncomfortable and enlightening. Uncomfortable because it challenges the choices that were made. Enlightening because it reveals how easily group narratives can shape perception. What matters most now is awareness. Awareness that people are capable of misunderstanding situations when emotions, alliances, and social pressure are involved. Awareness that fairness requires listening to more than one voice. Awareness that sometimes the quietest person in a conflict may have been trying to step away from something that others were not yet ready to examine. The truth about what happened may never be announced in a dramatic way. There may not be a moment where everyone gathers and rewrites the story together. Realizations like this usually unfold slowly through reflection, observation, and time. But once someone begins seeing the situation clearly, the old narrative loses its power, and the person who once removed themselves is no longer seen as the problem that needed to disappear, but as someone who simply chose distance from a dynamic that could only survive as long as nobody looked too closely.